Dare to push my wife, you are finished. Sanaa's husband, Sebastian, a billionaire tech mogul, angrily steps forward and tells the manager who insulted his wife. Next to him, his best friend Alexander, a store manager, storms in. Confronting the manager in a dramatic confrontation that will have you staring. Sebastian's wife, Sanaa, a calm black woman, was judged, insulted, and even pushed straight out the door at the Luxe Atelier in Austin, Texas, all because of her appearance. Will justice be served? What happens when great power meets blind prejudice? Stay tuned to find out. If this story makes you think, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our latest videos. Don't forget to comment where you're watching. Join us as we explore this unforgettable story of perseverance and reward. Trust me, you won't want to miss the ending. The Texas sun hung heavy over Austin's 6th Street, its relentless heat shimmering off the polished glass storefronts that lined the city's most exclusive strip. At the heart of this opulent corridor stood Luxe Atelier, a boutique where handbags weren't just accessories but artifacts, each one a testament to wealth and taste. The air outside buzzed with the hum of luxury cars and the chatter of well-heeled passers-by, but inside, a different kind of silence reigned, a silence that spoke of privilege and gatekeeping. Sanaa Wolfe pushed through the heavy glass doors, the faint chime of the motion sensor barely audible over the soft hum of air conditioning. Her white sundress swayed gently with each step, the hem brushing against her calves, and her simple sandals clicked softly on the gleaming marble floor. Her hair, swept into a neat bun, framed a face that radiated quiet confidence, though her only adornment was a thin silver wedding band that caught the light as she moved. To the untrained eye, she might have seemed out of place in this temple of extravagance, but Sanaa carried herself with the kind of poise that needed no validation. Her eyes scanned the store, taking in the meticulously arranged displays. Handbags, perched on velvet pedestals, their leather surfaces glowing under carefully angled spotlights. The scent of lavender and polished leather filled the air, a subtle perfume that seemed to whisper exclusivity. Her gaze settled on an emerald green Hermes Birkin, a limited edition masterpiece that had haunted her dreams for weeks. It sat behind a glass case, its vibrant hue calling to her like a beacon. Sanaa's lips curved into a faint smile. This was why she was here, not to prove anything but to claim what she'd earned. No one greeted her. The absence of a welcome was as deliberate as the store's pristine aesthetic. In the corner, Derek, a burly security guard with a shaved head and a scowl etched into his features, leaned against the wall. His eyes followed Sanaa, narrowing as she approached the Birkin display. He lifted his walkie-talkie, his voice a low mutter that cut through the silence like a blade. "She doesn't belong here," he said. The words meant for his colleague, but loud enough for Sanaa to catch. Her jaw tightened, a flicker of hurt passing through her dark eyes. But she didn't falter. She'd heard worse, felt this sting before. In department stores, restaurants, even job interviews where her presence seemed to surprise. She straightened her shoulders and stepped closer to the glass case, her resolve a shield against the guard's judgment. Behind the counter, 2 sales associates worked with practiced indifference. Claire, a young woman with a tight ponytail and a forced smile that never reached her eyes, adjusted a stack of silk scarves with unnecessary precision. Greg, older and balding, stood beside her, his fingers tracing the edge of a display tray, as if it held the secrets of the universe. They glanced at Sanaa when she entered, their eyes sliding over her dress, her sandals, her unadorned hands. The look they exchanged was brief but telling, a silent agreement that she wasn't worth their time. Their conversation resumed, a murmured exchange about inventory that filled the air with the pretense of busyness. Sanaa's presence was an inconvenience, a disruption to the curated perfection of their world. She approached the Birkin, her fingers hovering near the glass, not touching but close enough to signal intent. The bag was stunning, its craftsmanship evident in every stitch, every curve. She imagined holding it, feeling its weight in her hands, a symbol of the life she'd built from the ground up. "Excuse me," she said, her voice warm but firm, cutting through the associate's chatter. "I'd like to see this one." The words hung in the air, a quiet challenge to the room's indifference. Claire froze, her hand pausing mid-motion. Over the scarves. Her eyes darted to Greg, who gave the slightest shake of his head, a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not attuned to the undercurrents of exclusion. Claire's hand twitched as if she considered responding, but the weight of Greg's disapproval and the store's unspoken rules held her back. She turned away, her smile tightening into a thin line, and resumed her task. The silence that followed was louder than any rejection, a deliberate erasure of Sanaa's presence. Sanaa's chest tightened, but she didn't let it show. She'd faced this before. Rooms where her voice seemed to carry less weight, where her existence was questioned before she could even speak. She shifted her weight, her sandal tapping lightly against the marble, and prepared to speak again. But before she could, the air shifted. A shadow loomed behind her, accompanied by the crisp sound of polished shoes on the floor. Charles, the store manager, appeared like a specter of authority, tall and lean. His tailored suit hugged his frame, the navy fabric a stark contrast to his pale skin. His face was a mask of disdain, his lips curled into a sneer as he sized her up. He didn't bother with pleasantries. "This isn't a place for browsing," he said, his voice sharp and cold, each word a calculated jab. "These bags start at $20,000. If you're not buying, you need to leave." Sanaa met his gaze, unflinching. His words stung, but they didn't surprise her. She'd walked into enough spaces like this to know the script, the assumptions, the dismissals, the unspoken rules that judged her before she could act. "I'm here to buy," she said, her tone calm but laced with steel. She gestured toward the Birkin, her hand steady. "That one." Charles's sneer deepened, his eyes flicking from her dress to her sandals, then back to her face. He stepped closer, invading her space, his presence a wall of contempt. "We cater to serious clients," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You need to go, now." The command was final. A door slammed shut in her face. Sanaa's heart pounded, but her expression remained composed. She held his gaze for a moment longer, her silence a defiance louder than words. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with tension. Derek's walkie-talkie crackled in the corner. Claire's scarf display lay forgotten, and Greg's eyes darted nervously between them. The stage was set, the lines drawn. Sanaa knew she could walk away, but something in her refused to yield. Not here, not now. The air inside Luxe Atelier was thick with the scent of lavender and leather, a curated perfume that cloaked the boutique in an aura of untouchable elegance. The emerald green Hermes Birkin gleamed behind its glass case, its limited edition allure pulling Sanaa Wolfe closer, like a star drawing a weary traveler. Her white sundress swayed as she stood before the display, her simple sandals a quiet contrast to the polished marble beneath her feet. The thin silver wedding band on her finger caught the soft glow of the spotlights, a subtle reminder of the life she'd built, a life that should have granted her entry to this world of opulence. Yet the silence that greeted her arrival still lingered, heavy and deliberate, a wall erected by those who deemed her unworthy. Sanaa's gaze remained fixed on the Birkin, its vibrant hue a promise of something more than luxury, a symbol of her resilience, her triumphs over a world that often refused to see her. She took a breath, steadying herself against the sting of Derek's muttered words from the corner. "She doesn't belong here." The security guard's voice still echoed in her mind, but she pushed it aside, her resolve unshaken. She'd faced this before, spaces where her presence was questioned, where her worth was measured by the cut of her clothes or the shade of her skin. Today would be different. It had to be. She stepped closer to the counter, her fingers hovering near the glass, careful not to touch. Behind the polished mahogany, two sales associates worked with an air of rehearsed detachment, Claire, her ponytail, pulled tight, arranged a stack of silk scarves with the precision of a surgeon. Her movements deliberate, almost performative. Greg, older and slightly stooped, traced the edge of a display tray, his eyes darting everywhere but toward Sanaa. Their chatter filled the air, a low hum about inventory and sales targets, a convenient shield against the woman standing just feet away. They'd seen her enter, their fleeting glances cataloging her sundress, her sandals, her unadorned hands. The verdict was swift, unspoken. She wasn't their kind of customer. Sanaa cleared her throat, her voice cutting through their pretense like a blade. "Excuse me," she said, warm but firm. "I'd like to see this one." She nodded toward the Birkin, her eyes steady, a quiet challenge to the room's indifference. The words hung in the air, a ripple disturbing the boutique's carefully curated calm. Claire froze, her hand pausing mid-motion over the scarves. Her eyes flicked to Greg, a silent plea for guidance. Greg's response was subtle, a slight shake of his head, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone not attuned to the language of exclusion. Claire's hand twitched, as if she considered responding, but the weight of Greg's disapproval and the store's unspoken hierarchy held her back. Her lips pressed into a thin line and she turned away, resuming her task with renewed focus. The scarves demanded her attention, not the woman who dared to speak. Sanaa's chest tightened, a familiar ache spreading through her. She'd walked into rooms like this before, where her voice seemed to carry less weight, where her presence was a puzzle no one cared to solve. But she didn't flinch. She shifted her weight, her sandal tapping lightly against the marble, and prepared to speak again. "I'm interested in the Birkin," she said, her tone unwavering, each word a deliberate claim to her right to be there. The associate's silence was deafening, a rejection louder than words. Claire's fingers fumbled with a scarf, her discomfort palpable, but she didn't look up. Greg's eyes remained fixed on the tray, his indifference a wall. Sanaa's pulse quickened, but her expression stayed composed, a mask of calm hiding. The storm beneath. She knew this game, the subtle dismissals, the calculated ignorance. She'd played it and won before, and she would again. Before she could press further, the air shifted. A shadow loomed behind her, accompanied by the crisp sound of polished shoes on the marble floor. Charles, the store manager, emerged like a predator sensing weakness. Tall and lean, his navy suit was tailored to perfection, a stark contrast to his pale, angular face. His lips curled into a sneer, his eyes raking over Sanaa with undisguised contempt. He didn't bother with a greeting. "This isn't a place for browsing," he said, his voice sharp and cold, each word a barbed arrow. "These bags start at $20,000. If you're not buying, you need to leave." The words landed like a slap, their venom unmistakable. Sanaa met his gaze, her dark eyes unflinching. She'd heard this tone before, in boardrooms, boutiques, even classrooms, where her presence seemed to unsettle the status quo. "I'm here to buy," she said, her voice steady, laced with a quiet strength that refused to bend. She gestured toward the Birkin, her hand unwavering. "That one." Charles's sneer deepened, his eyes flicking from her dress to her sandals, then back to her face. He stepped closer, his presence a wall of arrogance, invading her space with deliberate intent. "We cater to serious clients," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. The word serious, a knife aimed at her dignity. "You need to go. Now." The command was final. A door slammed shut in her face. Sanaa's heart pounded, a drumbeat of anger and resolve. She held his gaze, her silence a defiance louder than any retort. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with tension. Derek's walkie-talkie crackled faintly in the corner, a reminder of the guard's earlier judgment. Claire's scarves lay forgotten, her hands still, her breath shallow. Greg's eyes darted nervously between Sanaa and Charles, sensing the storm brewing. The boutique, with its gleaming displays and curated elegance, had become a battlefield, and Sanaa stood at its center, unyielding. She took a breath, her voice low but clear. "I have every right to be here. she said, each word a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. Charles's eyes narrowed, his patience fraying, but Sanaa didn't move. The Birkin gleamed behind the glass, a silent witness to the clash of wills. The moment stretched, taut and electric, a prelude to the reckoning that loomed just beyond the horizon. The silence in Luxe Atelier was a living thing, coiling around Sanaa Wolfe like a serpent, its weight pressing against her chest. The emerald green Hermes Birkin gleamed behind its glass case, a distant dream now overshadowed by the storm brewing in the boutique's polished interior. Sanaa stood resolute, her white sundress a quiet defiance against the opulence that sought to exclude her. Her sandals anchored her to the marble floor, her thin silver wedding band catching the light as her hand rested near the counter. Charles, the store manager, loomed before her, his navy suit crisp, his pale face twisted with contempt. His words, "We cater to serious clients. You need to go now," still hung in the air, a gauntlet thrown at her feet. But Sanaa hadn't flinched. Her calm retort, "I'm here to buy," had been a spark, igniting the tinder of Charles's fragile ego. "You're not a customer," Charles snapped, his voice rising, sharp as a blade. His eyes, cold and unyielding, bored into her, searching for a crack in her composure. "You're wasting our time." The accusation was a lash, meant to sting, to drive her out. Sanaa's heart pounded, but her gaze held steady, dark and unyielding. She'd faced this kind of dismissal before, in boardrooms, in boutiques, in spaces where her presence was a challenge to the status quo. "I have every right to be here," she said, her voice low but resolute, each word a stone laid in the foundation of her defiance. "I'm interested in that Birkin, and I'm not leaving until I see it." The room seemed to contract, the high air thick with tension. Claire, the young sales associate, stood frozen behind the counter, her ponytail taut, her hands clutching a silk scarf as if it could shield her from the escalating conflict. Her eyes darted between Sanaa and Charles, wide with unease, but she remained silent, cowed by the manager's authority. Greg, older and more jaded, leaned against the counter, his fingers still, his face a mask of indifference. In the corner, Derek, the security guard, shifted his weight, his walkie-talkie crackling faintly, a reminder of his earlier judgment. She doesn't belong here. The boutique, with its lavender-scented air and gleaming displays, had become a crucible, and Sanaa was at its heart. Charles's face reddened, his patience unraveling like a frayed thread. The pressure of sales targets, the weight of maintaining, the store's pristine image, and his own deep-seated biases collided in a volatile mix. "I said get out," he roared, his voice echoing off the marble walls. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and shoved Sanaa's shoulder with a force that belied his tailored exterior. The push was sudden, brutal, sending her stumbling backward. Her sandal caught on the edge of a display rug, and she fell hard, her hands slamming against the cold marble to break her fall. Pain shot through her wrists, sharp and searing, but it was the sting of humiliation that cut deeper. The room went silent, the air sucked out as if by a vacuum. Claire gasped, her tablet slipping from her hands, clattering softly against the counter. Her instinct to help flickered, but Charles's glare pinned her in place, a silent command to stay out of it. Derek took a half-step forward, his hand raised, his face a battleground of conflict. "Don't," Charles hissed, his voice low and venomous. "One word, and you're fired." Derek froze, his hand dropping, his eyes clouded with guilt and fear. Greg remained still, his indifference a wall, his silence a betrayal. The boutique, once a bastion of elegance, now felt like a cage, its beauty tainted by the ugliness of prejudice. Sanaa's breath came in shallow bursts, the pain in her wrists pulsing with each heartbeat. She pushed herself up, her movements deliberate, her sundress settling around her like a flag of resilience. Her eyes burned, not with tears, but with a fire that refused to be extinguished. She stood, brushing the dust from her dress, her dignity a shield against the room's hostility. The bruise forming on her wrist was a quiet testament to the assault, a mark she carried with a strange pride. She'd been knocked down before, by life, by judgment, by systems that saw her as less, but she always rose. Her hand trembled as she reached for her phone, the silver band glinting under the spotlights. She dialed 911, her voice steady despite the storm within. "I've been assaulted," she said, her words clear, cutting through the operator's questions. "Luxe Atelier, 6th Street, Austin." She hung up, her eyes never leaving Charles, who stood rigid, his sneer replaced by a flicker of unease. The wait was agonizing, the minutes stretching like hours. Claire's hands shook, Greg's eyes darted to the door, and Derek's walkie-talkie crackled, a nervous tick in the silence. When the two police officers arrived, their boots heavy on the marble, Sanaa felt a flicker of hope, but it died quickly. One officer, a broad-shouldered man with a familiar nod toward Charles, listened as the manager spun a tale of misunderstanding. "She was disruptive," Charles lied, his voice smooth, his confidence returning. The officer's partner, younger and less certain, glanced at Sanaa, but the older man waved her off. "Sounds like you're making a big deal out of nothing," he said, his tone dismissive. "Let's not waste time here." Sanaa's jaw tightened, the betrayal a fresh wound. She'd called for justice, but found only another layer of indifference, another system that saw her as less. She stepped toward the door, her phone still in hand, her bruise a silent scream. "This isn't over," she said, her voice low, a promise to herself as much as to them. The glass doors hissed shut behind her, the Texas heat enveloping her like an embrace. She stood under the awning, her heart a drumbeat of resolve, unaware that the tide was about to turn. The Texas heat pressed against Sanaa Wolfe like a living thing, its oppressive weight wrapping around her, as she stood beneath the awning of Luxe Atelier. The glass doors behind her had hissed shut, sealing off the boutique's lavender-scented interior and the sting of what had just transpired. Her white sundress clung to her skin, damp with the sweat of a battle fought and not yet won. Her sandals felt unsteady on the pavement, but her posture remained unyielding, a pillar of defiance against the injustice that had bruised her wrist and her pride. The faint purple mark on her skin throbbed, a silent testament to Charles's shove, the fall to the marble floor, and the indifferent dismissal of the police who'd waved her off, as if her pain were a trivial inconvenience. Sanaa's breath came in shallow bursts, her heart a drumbeat of anger and resolve. The memory of the officer's words, "Sounds like you're making a big deal out of nothing," cut deeper than the fall itself. She'd called for justice but found only another wall, another system that saw her as less. Her hand trembled as she clutched her phone, the thin silver wedding band glinting under the midday sun. She unlocked the screen, her fingers moving with purpose despite the tremor. She typed a message to her husband, Sebastian, each word a flare sent into the void. "They pushed me. Kan sat kung kong giup." She hit send, her eyes fixed on the horizon, where 6th Street pulsed with the rhythm of Austin's elite. The text was more than a cry for help. It was a signal, a beacon that would summon a reckoning. Inside Luxe Atelier, the air was still thick with the aftermath of the assault. Claire, the young sales associate, stood behind the counter, her ponytail askew, her hands fidgeting with a silk scarf she no longer cared to arrange. Her eyes darted to the glass doors, as if expecting Sanaa to return, or perhaps fearing what might follow. Greg, older and more jaded, leaned against the display, his indifference cracking under the weight of what he'd witnessed. He'd seen Charles shove Sanaa, seen her fall, seen the police brush it off, and now a flicker of unease stirred in his chest. Derek, the security guard, paced near the entrance, his walkie-talkie silent, his earlier words, "She doesn't belong," here, now a bitter echo. He'd wanted to intervene, had raised his hand, but Charles's threat had silenced him. Guilt gnawed at him, a shadow he couldn't shake. Outside, Sanaa stood alone, the Texas sun a harsh spotlight on her solitude. She slipped her phone into her pocket, her gaze sweeping the street. The boutique's awning offered little shade, but she didn't move, rooted by a resolve that burned brighter than the heat. She'd faced worse than this, growing up in Houston's Third Ward, clawing her way through law school, building a non-profit for kids who dreamed beyond their circumstances. This moment, this bruise, this betrayal by the police was just another hurdle she would not break. Unbeknownst to her, the signal she'd sent had already set events in motion. A few blocks away, in a sleek office overlooking downtown Austin, Sebastian Wolfe sat at a glass desk, his phone buzzing with Sanaa's message. His jaw tightened as he read the words, each one a dagger. A tech mogul whose name graced Forbes lists, Sebastian was no stranger to power, but this was personal. Beside him, Alexander Duval, the director of Luxe Atelier and his lifelong friend, leaned over a monitor displaying the store's live camera feed. They'd been monitoring the boutique for weeks, spurred by complaints of discriminatory behavior from customers who didn't fit the staff's narrow vision of wealth. The footage they'd just watched, Charles shoving Sanaa, the police dismissing, her lit a fire in Alexander's eyes. "We're going now," Sebastian said, his voice a low growl. Alexander nodded, grabbing his jacket. "He's done." The hum of 6th Street shifted, a new sound cutting through the chatter of passers-by. A low guttural roar echoed down the boulevard, the unmistakable growl of a matte black Lamborghini Aventador. Its sleek lines gleamed under the sun, a predator slicing through the city's pulse. Inside Luxe Atelier, the sound snapped the staff. "To attention." Claire's head jerked up, her scarf forgotten, her eyes wide with anticipation. Greg straightened, his indifference replaced by a salesman's instinct for opportunity. "VIP," he muttered, smoothing his tie. Derek adjusted his stance at the door, his guilt momentarily overshadowed by the prospect of a high roller. We assumed wealth was arriving, someone who fit their mold of exclusivity, someone who belonged. The Lamborghini pulled to the curb, its gullwing doors rising like the wings of a dark angel. The staff craned their necks, eager to catch a glimpse of the new arrival. Claire rushed to the glass doors, her tablet clutched like a lifeline, ready to fawn over whoever stepped out. Greg followed, his steps quick, his earlier unease buried under the promise of a big sale. Derek opened the door, his posture rigid, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt, a nagging sense that something was amiss. Sanaa turned at the sound of the engine, her heart skipping a beat. She knew that car, knew the man behind the wheel. The doors lifted fully, and 2 figures emerged, their presence a seismic shift in the street's rhythm. Sebastian Wolfe stepped out first, his tailored blazer sharp against his broad frame, his jaw set with a fury that made the air crackle. Alexander Duval followed, his silver cufflinks catching the light, his glasses glinting with a cold determination. Their faces were thunderclouds, their steps purposeful, a storm converging on Luxe Atelier. Sanaa stood by the curb, her composure a fortress, the bruise on her wrist a quiet badge of her ordeal. She met Sebastian's gaze, a silent exchange passing between them, pain, love, and an unspoken promise of justice. The staff inside froze, their eager smiles faltering as they registered the men's expressions. Claire's tablet slipped slightly, Greg's tie-smoothing halted, and Derek's hand hovered over his walkie-talkie, unsure. The signal had been sent, and the response was here, a force that would shake the boutique's foundations. The glass doors of Luxe Atelier swung open with a hiss, the motion sensors chime a feeble whisper against the storm that surged into the boutique. Sebastian Wolfe and Alexander Duval crossed the threshold, their presence a seismic force that shattered the boutique's curated calm. Sebastian's tailored blazer hugged his broad frame, his jaw set with a fury that made the air crackle. Alexander, his silver cufflinks glinting under the spotlights, adjusted his glasses, his eyes cold and unyielding behind the lenses. Outside, Sanaa Wolfe stood by the curb, her white sundress catching the Texas breeze, the bruise on her wrist a silent accusation. The matte black Lamborghini Aventador idled behind her, its low growl a prelude to the reckoning unfolding within. Inside, the boutique's lavender-scented air felt stale, tainted by the memory of what had transpired. Charles, the store manager, stood frozen near the counter, his navy suit suddenly seeming too tight, his pale face drained of color. He'd been expecting a VIP, a client to flatter and appease, but the men before him were no ordinary customers. Claire, the young sales associate, clutched her tablet, her ponytail askew, her earlier eagerness replaced by a dawning dread. Greg, older and more jaded, smoothed his tie nervously, his indifference crumbling under the weight of the moment. Derek, the security guard, lingered near the door, his walkie-talkie silent, his guilt a heavy shadow cast by his failure to act. Charles took a hesitant step forward, his voice faltering. "Mr. Duval, sir, we weren't expecting you," he stammered, his usual arrogance fraying at the edges. His eyes darted to Sebastian, then back to Alexander, searching for a lifeline. But Alexander's gaze was steel, his voice cutting, through the manager's feeble attempt at composure. "We saw everything, Charles," he said, each word a hammer striking stone. He raised a hand, pointing to a discreet camera nestled above the counter, its red light blinking like an unblinking. "The footage caught every second, every word, every shove, every lie you told the police." The room seemed to shrink, the marble walls closing in as the truth laid bare. Charles's knees buckled slightly, his sneer replaced by a flicker of panic. Claire's tablet slipped from her hands, clattering against the counter, the sound sharp. In the suffocating silence, Greg's fingers froze on his tie, his eyes wide as if seeing the boutique for the first time, a place not of elegance, but of shame. Derek's hand hovered over his walkie-talkie, his earlier words, "She doesn't belong here," now a noose around his conscience. Sebastian stepped forward, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm. He turned to Sanaa, who had followed, them inside, her sandals clicking softly on the marble. His hand found hers, his touch gentle but firm, his fingers brushing the bruise on her wrist. "This is my wife," he said, his voice low and dangerous, each word a blade aimed at Charles's heart. "The woman you insulted, dismissed, and pushed to the floor in my friend's store, the woman you lied about to the police, who saw fit to ignore her pain." His eyes, dark and unyielding, locked onto Charles, stripping away the manager's veneer of authority. "You thought you could erase her, didn't you?" Charles opened his mouth, but no words came. His hands twitched at his sides, his confidence unraveling like a cheap suit. The boutique, with its gleaming displays and velvet pedestals, felt like a stage, and he was the villain exposed under the spotlight. Sanaa stood beside Sebastian, her composure a fortress, her dark eyes fixed on Charles. She didn't speak. Her presence was enough, a silent indictment of the prejudice that had sought to diminish her. The bruise on her wrist, now a vivid purple, was a mark of her resilience, a badge she wore with quiet pride. Alexander took a step closer, his voice calm but laced with an edge that cut deeper than any shout. "You didn't just judge her, Charles," he said, his glasses glinting under the lights. "You put your hands on her. You lied to the police who dismissed her because of men like you, men who think wealth and power belong to a certain face, a certain skin." He gestured to the camera again, its red light a relentless witness. "And you thought you'd get away with it. But this store, this brand is mine, and I don't tolerate cowards who hide behind their biases." Claire's breath hitched, her hands shaking as she pressed them against the counter. Greg's face flushed, his earlier indifference, now a source of shame. Derek shifted uncomfortably, his eyes dropping to the floor, the weight of his silence heavier than ever. The boutique's elegance, the Hermes Birkin, the silk scarves, the polished marble, felt hollow, a facade that crumbled under the truth. Charles's lips moved, a weak attempt at defense forming, but Alexander raised a hand, silencing him. "Save it," he said, his voice final. "You've done enough." Sebastian's gaze never left Charles, his fury a controlled blaze. You saw a woman in a sundress and sandals and decided she wasn't worth your time, he said, his voice steady but searing. You didn't see her strength, her work, her heart. You didn't see the woman who built a non-profit for kids, who fought her way through a world that tried to hold her back. You saw what you wanted to see, and you were wrong. He squeezed Sanaa's hand, a silent vow that this would not stand. The tension in the room was a living thing, electric and unyielding. Charles's shoulders slumped, his career teetering on the edge of collapse. Claire's eyes glistened, her silence a confession of complicity. Greg's hands fell to his sides, his salesman's instincts useless against the tide of justice. Derek's walkie-talkie crackled faintly, a nervous tick in the stillness. Sanaa stood tall, her bruise a battle scar, her presence a beacon. The confrontation had begun, and the boutique would never be the same. The air in Luxe Atelier was heavy, charged with the aftermath of a truth laid bare. The boutique's polished marble floor, once a symbol of untouchable elegance, now felt like a courtroom, its gleaming surface reflecting the weight of judgment. Sanaa Wolfe stood at the center, her white sundress a beacon of resilience, her sandals planted firmly against the cold stone. The bruise on her wrist, a vivid purple under the boutique's soft lights, was a silent indictment, a mark of the violence that had sought to diminish her. Beside her, Sebastian Wolfe's hand rested gently on hers, his fury a controlled blaze, his dark eyes fixed on Charles, the store manager whose arrogance had crumbled. Alexander Duval, the boutique's director, stood tall, his silver cufflinks glinting, his voice still echoing with the damning evidence of the camera footage that had exposed Charles's sins. Charles was a shadow of his former self, his navy suit hanging loosely on his slumped frame, his pale face ashen with the realization that his career was unraveling. His earlier sneer had vanished, replaced by a trembling lip and eyes that darted desperately for an escape that didn't exist. Claire, the young sales associate, pressed herself against the counter, her ponytail askew, her tablet forgotten, her breath shallow with the guilt of her silence. Greg, older and jaded, stared at the floor, his hands limp, his indifference shattered by the confrontation that had stripped the boutique of its facade. Derek, the security guard, lingered near the door, his walkie-talkie mute, his earlier failure to act a wound that bled shame. Sanaa stepped forward, her presence commanding the room like a queen reclaiming her throne. Her voice, when it came, was steady, a river carving through stone. "I grew up in Houston's 3rd Ward," she began, her eyes locking onto Charles, piercing through his crumbling defenses. A place where dreams were hard-won, where every step forward was a fight. I clawed my way through law school, built a non-profit for kids who deserve better, and married a man who sees me for who I am, not what I wear or how I look. She raised her wrist, the bruise a stark contrast against her skin. But to you, I was nothing. A woman in a sundress who didn't look rich enough to belong. Her words were a mirror, forcing Charles to confront the ugliness of his prejudice. He flinched, his hands twitching, but he couldn't look away. Sanaa's voice grew stronger, each syllable a hammer striking the boutique's hollow elegance. You didn't see my work, my heart, my life. You saw a stereotype and decided I wasn't worth your time. And when I stood my ground, you pushed. Literally to the floor. You thought you could erase me, but you were wrong. The room was still, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning, a feeble counterpoint to the weight of her truth. Sebastian's grip on her hand tightened. A silent anchor, his fury tempered by pride in her strength. Alexander's glasses caught the light as he nodded, his face a mask of resolve. Claire's eyes glistened, tears threatening to spill, her complicity a burden she could no longer ignore. Greg's shoulders sagged, his silence a confession. Derek's hand clenched around his walkie-talkie, his guilt a tangible force. Alexander stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Charles," he said, his tone calm but unyielding, "you're terminated, effective immediately." The words landed like a gavel, final and irrevocable. Charles's jaw dropped, his career collapsing in a single breath. "Pack your things," Alexander continued, his gaze unwavering. "You'll be on paid leave for a month, but you'll write a full account of what you did. Every thought, every action, every lie you told the police. If it's not honest, don't bother coming back." Charles stammered, his voice a broken whisper. I didn't mean a... But Alexander raised a hand, silencing him. "You meant every word, every shove," he said. "You chose to judge, to harm, to lie, and now you face the consequences." The boutique seemed to exhale, the weight of justice settling over the room. Claire's tears spilled over, her hands trembling against the counter. Greg's face flushed, his eyes still fixed on the floor, unable to meet the truth. Sebastian's voice was a low growl, his words aimed at Charles but resonating for all to hear. "You're lucky she's not pressing charges," he said, his eyes burning. "But don't mistake her mercy for weakness. Sanaa is stronger than you'll ever understand." He turned to her, his gaze softening, a silent vow that this would not define her. Derek stepped forward, his broad frame hunched, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Wolfe," he said, his eyes meeting hers with a raw vulnerability. "I should have stopped him. I raised my hand, but I froze. I'm sorry." His words were heavy, a confession born of shame. Sanaa's gaze softened, but her voice was firm. "I see you, Derek," she said, "but words aren't enough. Next time, act." Derek nodded, his head bowing, the weight of her forgiveness a challenge to be better. The boutique was a crucible, its elegance stripped away to reveal the raw truth beneath. The Hermes Birkin gleamed behind its glass, a silent witness to the reckoning. Charles stood alone, his authority shattered, his future uncertain. Claire and Greg were statues, their silence a mirror of their complicity. Sanaa stood tall, her bruise a battle scar, her voice a beacon. The confrontation had ended, but the ripple of its impact was only beginning, a tide that would reshape the boutique and all who stood within it. The silence in Luxe Atelier was no longer oppressive, but reverent, a hush that followed the storm, of truth and reckoning. The boutique's marble floor gleamed under the soft glow of spotlights, but its elegance felt transformed, as if the very walls had absorbed the weight of what had transpired. Sanaa Wolfe stood at the heart of the room, her white sundress a symbol of unyielding grace, her sandals rooted to the ground like the foundations of a monument. The bruise on her wrist, a stark purple against her skin, was no longer just a mark of violence but a badge of her resilience. Beside her, Sebastian Wolfe's hand rested lightly on hers, his fury now a quiet strength, his eyes reflecting pride in the woman who had turned pain into power. Alexander Duval, the boutique's director, adjusted his glasses, his silver cufflinks catching the light, his presence a steady anchor in the wake of justice served. Charles was gone, his navy suit a fading memory, his career shattered by his own prejudice. The counter where he'd once stood as gatekeeper was now a silent witness to his downfall. Claire, the young sales associate, leaned against it, her ponytail loose, tears streaking her face, her earlier silence a wound she couldn't ignore. Greg, older and humbled, stood with his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the floor, his complicity, a lesson etched into his conscience. Derek, the security guard, lingered near the door, his walkie-talkie mute, his apology to Sanaa a step toward redemption, but not yet enough. Alexander stepped toward the display case, his movements deliberate. He unlocked the glass, his fingers brushing the emerald-green Hermes Birkin that had sparked this saga. He lifted it with care, its leather gleaming under the lights, and turned to Sanaa. "This is yours," he said, his voice resonant, carrying the weight of amends, not as a trophy but as a reminder of your strength, your right to be here. He placed the bag in her hands, its weight a tangible affirmation of her victory. Zani's fingers traced the leather, her touch reverent but not possessive. She didn't need the Birkin to define her. She never had. but it was a symbol, a testament to her refusal to be erased. She turned to the staff, her gaze sweeping. Over Claire, Greg, and Derek, each word a spark that could ignite change. "This isn't about me," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, a beacon in the boutique's transformed air. "It's about every person who walks through these doors and gets judged before they speak. I didn't come here to prove myself. I earned my place through work, through struggle, through a life you never bothered to see." Her eyes lingered on Claire, whose tears flowed freely, and Greg, whose head bowed lower. "I fought to be here, not for your approval, but because I belong, and so does everyone else who's ever been made to feel small." The room was still, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning, a backdrop to Sanaa's words. Sebastian's hand tightened on hers, a silent vow of support. Alexander nodded, his resolve mirroring hers. "Starting next week," he announced, his voice firm, "every employee in every store will undergo mandatory training, not just on products but on people, on seeing them, not judging them. No one gets to decide who belongs." His gaze swept the room, a challenge to the staff to rise or fall. "And those police officers who dismissed Sanaa's pain. We're reporting their conduct to the authorities. This ends now." Claire's sobs broke the silence, her hands covering her face, her guilt a tide she couldn't stem. Greg's shoulders shook, his silence no longer a shield but a confession. Derek stepped forward, his voice low. "I'll be there," he said, his eyes meeting Sanaa's. "I'll learn." She nodded, her expression softening, a recognition of his intent to change. Sebastian spoke, his voice a steady drumbeat. "Luxe Atelier isn't about arrogance," he said, his words aimed at the staff but resonating beyond the boutique's walls. "It's about welcoming everyone who walks through that door, no matter their dress, their skin, their story. You failed that today, but you don't have to fail it tomorrow." His eyes met Sanaa's, a shared vision of a world where respect was not a privilege but a right. Sanaa lifted the Birkin, holding it not as a prize but as a promise. She turned to leave, her sandals clicking softly on the marble, Sebastian at her side. The glass doors parted, the Texas heat greeting her like an old friend. She slid into the Lamborghini, the Birkin resting on her lap, not a status symbol, but a reminder of her unyielding spirit. The car roared to life, carrying them away from the boutique, but Sanaa's work wasn't done. That evening, in their Austin penthouse, Sanaa sat by a window overlooking the city's twinkling lights. The Birkin rested on a table, beside photos of the kids from her nonprofit, smiling faces who reminded her why she fought. She opened her phone, her fingers moving with purpose. She typed a post, her words a clarion call. "Respect isn't bought. It's owed. Don't let anyone make you feel less." She hit send, the message rippling into the digital ether. Comments flooded in, a chorus of voices from across the globe. A young woman wrote, "I was ignored in a store last week. Your story gives me hope." A man added, "I've been there, judged for how I look. Thank you for speaking up." Sanaa read each one, her heart swelling with the knowledge that her pain had become a beacon for others. The boutique's marble walls were far behind, but the standard she'd set was just beginning to take root, a legacy that would outlast. The bruise on her wrist. Sanaa Wolfe's story is more than a moment. It's a mirror for all of us. Have you ever been judged before you could speak or stood up against injustice? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. We'd love to hear how this story resonates with you. Your voice matters. A huge thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of resilience and justice. If Sanaa's courage inspired you, hit that subscribe button to catch our next story, and let us know where you're watching from. Until then, keep shining, keep fighting, and we'll see you soon.